How do local challenges of racial injustice within the US and the UK house global connections? My team addresses this through the discussion of historical communities and the politics of space. Between Carnera, Laura Lacey, Chris, Rachel, and myself, we hope that you will be able to have a little more knowledge on this subject as you listen to our presentation. The University of Alabama dedicated Malone Hood Plaza in honor of James Hood and Vivian Malone's integration on November 3, 2010. Malone Hood Plaza was built in front of Foster's Auditorium, where George Wallace attempted to stop Vivian Malone and James Hood from registering to become students at UA. Wallace ran his state with beliefs that were deeply rooted in racism and segregation. He believed and advocated for the racist lie, separate but equal. Suzanne Dovey, author of In Praise of Exclusion, argues that marginalization occurs when informal norms and practices constrain, mute, or render less effective the representatives of certain interests, opinions, and perspectives in formal democratic institutions. The cumulative effect of these norms and practices can be to bar certain groups from having an effective political voice. George Wallace's stand in the schoolhouse door to bar Vivian Malone and James Hood from registering at the University of Alabama is an example of integrative marginalization. Integrative marginalization occurs when the informal norms of democratic procedures prevent certain members from assimilating into dominant political institutions. In this case, registering to become university students at a public state school. Governor Wallace was attempting to prevent Malone and Hood's integration, which is an example of how African Americans were being marginalized based on race when it came to education, especially in the South. Malone Hood Plaza has become a space for remembrance to honor those students' bravery as well as to remember the racist history of the past to not repeat it and instead learn from it. The activist group We Are Done demands change in many areas on campus, including holding demonstrations in front of Foster Auditorium, since the space serves as a symbol of past racism and integration's triumph over George Wallace's stand in the schoolhouse door. Students protested by stopping traffic on University Boulevard, marching to Amelia Gorgas Library. The protest ended with student speakers addressing issues including the machine, racism, and sexual assault. This particular movement has continued to be recognized by campus through their fight for change. Renaming university buildings is an attempt to demarginalize the African American community as well as erase a history of racism. Since there were not many buildings that represented African Americans and honored their accomplishments, while there were many that still honored members of the Ku Klux Klan and racists, some of the buildings have been changed to honor the accomplishments of African Americans on our campus. Before these buildings were renamed, this lack of representation was secondary marginalization. Secondary marginalization occurs when members of a historically disadvantaged group police and regulate the meaning of a group's identity. For example, notions of what it means to be a real African American can prevent the preferences of certain African Americans from being voiced and defended. Many people are angry at how media portray African Americans in the news as primarily being criminals or athletes. The renaming of these buildings honor African Americans who significantly impacted UA, such as Autherine Lucy, who attempted to integrate the University of Alabama. Suzanne Dovey argues that the adequate representation of historically disadvantaged groups may require those who occupy relationships of privilege to shut up, recuse themselves, or even resign coveted positions to make space for disadvantaged groups. The university found that the lack of diversity of minorities' contributions and the overrepresentation and remembrance of white supremacists needed to be changed on campus. Dovey argues that members of those groups that are underrepresented need to demand the exclusion of overrepresented privileged groups, not simply the inclusion of their own groups. This is what students and faculty fought for when seeking to rename buildings. By stripping buildings of names that sought to glorify racists and replacing them with historic African Americans who need to be honored, the university is attempting to demarginalize a space that has been representative of racism. Some of the name changes include Moore Hall as Wade Hall, Bibb Graves Hall as Autherine Lucy Hall, and the Ferguson Student Center as the University of Alabama Student Center. Wade Hall honors the first African American faculty member, Dr. Archie Wade. He served in the Department of Kinesiology for 30 years before retiring. Bibb Graves Hall was named after David Bibb Graves, a former governor of Alabama who had ties to the Ku Klux Klan. The white supremacy group believes the white race is superior and has a history of committing hate crimes against minorities, mainly black people. In Superior, in 2022, the University of Alabama renamed Bibb Graves Hall to Autherine Lucy Hall. Autherine Lucy was the first African American student to try to integrate the University of Alabama. After 3 days of enrollment, she was expelled. After UA was integrated, Lucy received her master's degree in education. The Ferguson Student Center was named after William Hill Ferguson, who was a former board of trustee who was against integration. Ferguson's name was taken off of the building last year. The university still honored him by naming the theater inside the center the Ferguson Theater. Even though some of Ferguson's values did not align with UA's, the university still believed he should be honored in a small way. This was an attempt to commemorate and memorialize African Americans by giving them the honor and respect they deserve. By challenging the racist narrative of UA's past, minorities were able to be honored by the renaming of buildings on campus. We Are Done requested that the university remove the names of white supremacists, Klansmen, Confederate generals, and eugenicists from classroom names, buildings, or to create markers to show the history of racism the building's namesakes are associated with. The student leaders argued that whenever a black student walked into a building on campus, the building's namesake glorified white supremacy while simultaneously ignoring black history on campus. For example, John Tyler Morgan, a KKK Grand Dragon Klansman, housed the English department at the University of Alabama, where hundreds of African American students were forced to walk down his halls to attend class. The building is now called English Hall. The social movement We Are Done enabled minorities to be represented on campus through their demonstrations and demands they placed on UA. On April 16, 2022, John Mitchell and Wilbur Jackson, the first two black football players to play for UA, were honored with a marker at the Walk of Champions. After losing to the University of Southern California, UA decided it was time to integrate their football team. John Mitchell and Wilbur Jackson were given athletic scholarships. UA was the last school to integrate its football team within the Southeastern Conference. As a result of the integrated team, Bear Bryant received death threats and the team was punished indirectly. John Mitchell credits Bear Bryant for his courage since Bryant fought for change. The first black football players being memorialized in front of Bryant-Denny Stadium finally gave representation and honor to black football players, especially on this campus. This served to demarginalize significant African Americans. The author of In Praise of Exclusion claims that improving the representation of historically disadvantaged groups requires also adopting another perspective. By honoring the first black football players, the Walk of Champions, which has primarily honored white players in a space outside where mainly black football players take the field now, has become a space where African American narratives can be honored and told. Racism can be defined as being a matter of individual prejudices and the ways these are expressed in word and deed. Wallace's actions as governor are blatant acts of racism. This topic relates to the racism that is expressed by Liverpool's docks, since they helped the city prosper during the transatlantic slave trade. At the time of slavery, Liverpool was dubbed the metropolis of slavery and had an annual investment in the slave trade of £2,641,200. Just like Governor Wallace and many members of the KKK that were honored on campus before UA implemented name changes, the environment in Liverpool fostered racism and pushed the dogma that one ethnic group is condemned by nature to congenital inferiority and another group is destined to congenital superiority. This perspective that both nations have adopted has led to a predetermined societal assumption that blacks were inferior and whites were superior. Social movements and activist groups have continued to fight for racial justice on UA and Liverpool's campuses, as well as across the globe. Political participation is described by scholars Verba and Nile as activities by private citizens that are more or less directly aimed at influencing the selection of governmental personnel and/or the actions they take. This can be seen in the race reckoning of 2020 after the death of George Floyd in America, and the rise of Black Lives Matter, which sparked protests across the globe, including the UK. Former Prime Minister Boris Johnson was slammed by activists for downplaying the role of systematic racism in the country, which didn't bode well for him, and eventually Johnson resigned. Chinatown in Liverpool was the first Chinatown to exist in Europe. Chinatown was created by immigrants in the 1850s. The creation brought forth strong trade links between Liverpool, Shanghai, and Hong Kong. Chinatown also serves as a community for international Chinese students that attend the University of Liverpool. Although Chinatown enables its residents to be self-sufficient and maintain traditional values and cultural identities, it was also met with disdain. The Western perception of the Chinese that is apparent in Chinatown across the globe is a racist one of gambling, sex, and opium. This created the rise of the Yellow Peril. The Yellow Peril was a solution to exclude the Chinese from British soil altogether. This led to what was known as Chinophobia and the deportation of 200 Chinese men despite their accomplishments. This discrimination and demonization of a group based on skin color is related to the discrimination of minorities and African Americans in America. The same superiority that whites displayed by excluding the Chinese community was the same as the superiority whites displayed by excluding black students from registering to attend the University of Alabama, as well as not honoring African Americans until the first black football players were honored at the Walk of Champions. Minority inferiority prevented both Chinese in Chinatown and African Americans in America from obtaining housing, education, and jobs. The civil rights movement in the U.S. and activist groups such as Black Lives Matter and We Are Done work to change the racist narrative America has told for so long by working to promote Black excellence and minority groups' accomplishments and equality. Here are the sources we used for this presentation. Thank you for listening to How Local Challenges of Racial Injustice Within the USA and the UK House Global Connections Throughout Historical Communities and the Politics of Space.